What if I told you that the most powerful empire in human history was not destroyed by a single battle, a single army, or a single catastrophic moment, but by something far more terrifying, slow, invisible, and inevitable? Because the truth is, Rome did not fall in a day. It bled out over centuries, hollowed from the inside by corruption, greed, and the weight of its own greatness, until one quiet afternoon in the year 476, the last Roman emperor in the West handed over his imperial insignia to a barbarian general named Odoacer, and the world barely flinched. There were no trumpets, no finalchart, no dramatic last stand on the steps of the Senate. Just a man handing over a crown and the longest story in Western history going silent. But how? How does an empire that once stretched from the shores of Britain to the deserts of Mesopotamia, that built roads still walked upon today, aqueducts still studied in universities, and laws still embedded in the foundations of modern civilization, how does something like that simply stop existing? That is the question we're going to answer today. And the answer will surprise you, because the barbarians who destroyed Rome were not the savage, mindless hordes that Hollywood has sold you. They were something far more complex. And Rome, the eternal city, the invincible empire, was far more fragile than anyone wanted to admit. Before we dive in, make sure to subscribe to the channel so you never miss a story like this one. And drop a comment below. Which civilization do you think we should cover next? Now, let's go back to the beginning. Let's go back to when Rome was still a dream made of marble and iron. At its height, the Roman Empire was not just a political entity. It was an idea, a living, breathing argument that human beings, when organized with sufficient discipline and ambition, could impose order upon the chaos of the world. By the 2nd century of the Common Era, Rome governed roughly 5 million square kilometers of territory and somewhere between 50 and 90 million people. More than a quarter of the entire human population on Earth lived under Roman law. The engineering alone was staggering. The Romans built over 80,000 kilometers of roads, constructed aqueducts that carried millions of liters of clean water into cities daily, and fielded legions that were the finest military machine the ancient world had ever produced, disciplined, adaptable, and terrifyingly efficient. A Roman legion did not simply fight. It fortified, it built, it administered. It was an army and a government rolled into one. And yet, even at the peak of this power, the seeds of collapse were already being planted. The Roman Empire in its final centuries was not the confident, expanding machine of Augustus or Trajan. It was a bureaucratic monster that had grown too large to govern itself coherently. Emperors rose and fell with alarming speed. In the 3rd century alone, the so-called crisis of the 3rd century between the years 235 and 284 saw more than 50 men claim the title of emperor. Many of them lasted only months. Some lasted weeks. The empire fractured into regional power blocks, each with its own army, its own currency, its own loyalties. The economy deteriorated. Inflation ravaged Roman coins as emperors debased the silver content to pay their troops. Trade routes that had once hummed with commerce grew dangerous and unreliable. Tax burdens crushed the middle class of farmers and merchants who had once formed the backbone of Roman society. Plague swept through the empire repeatedly, killing millions and leaving fields unworked and cities underpopulated. The Roman Empire of the 4th and 5th centuries was not the Rome of legend. It was an exhausted giant, still standing through sheer institutional momentum, but wobbling badly. And it was precisely at this moment of internal weakness that the world beyond Rome's borders began to shift in ways no Roman strategist had anticipated. To understand what happened next, we need to talk about the people Rome called barbarians. The word itself comes from the Greek barbaros, which the Greeks used to describe anyone who did not speak Greek. The sound of their foreign languages seemed like nonsense syllables, bar, 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 to Greek ears. The Romans inherited the term and applied it broadly to all the peoples living beyond the Rhine and the Danube rivers, the great natural frontiers of the empire's northern and eastern edges. But these so-called barbarians were not the primitive cave dwellers of popular imagination. The Germanic tribes, the Visigoths, the Ostrogoths, the Vandals, the Franks, the Saxons, the Burgundians, had complex social structures, sophisticated metalworking, trade networks, oral traditions of poetry and law, and military traditions every bit as formidable as Rome's in open field combat. Many of them had lived alongside Rome for generations. They traded with Romans, served in Roman armies, adopted Roman goods and sometimes Roman customs, and watched the empire closely from the other side of the river. For centuries, the Rhine-Danube frontier had been a border zone of constant negotiation, sometimes violent, sometimes peaceful, but always a conversation between two worlds. Roman generals hired Germanic warriors as mercenaries, a practice known as the foederati system. Germanic chieftains sent their sons to be educated in Roman cities. Roman merchants crossed the frontier to buy amber, furs, and slaves. The boundary between Roman and barbarian was far more permeable than the textbooks suggest. What changed everything, what turned this uneasy coexistence into catastrophe, was not a Roman decision. It was an event on the other side of the world that sent a shockwave across the Eurasian steppe and did not stop until it reached the walls of Rome itself. Their name was the Huns, and their arrival changed the history of the world. The Huns were a nomadic people from the steppes of Central Asia, possibly originating in the region that is now Mongolia, though historians still debate their exact origins and ethnic composition. What is not debated is their impact. By the 370s of the Common Era, the Huns had swept westward across the steppe with a ferocity that left entire peoples fleeing in terror before them. They were exceptional horsemen, fighting with composite bows from horseback with an accuracy and speed that no settled army of the time could match. They did not build cities or farm fields. They moved like a storm, consuming everything in their path and leaving nothing behind. When the Huns reached the lands north of the Black Sea, they collided with the Ostrogoths, a powerful Germanic people who had built a kingdom there. The Ostrogoths were obliterated or absorbed. The shock wave then hit the Visigoths to the west, another Germanic people, equally powerful, equally organized. The Visigoths faced a choice: be annihilated by the Huns, or throw themselves on the mercy of Rome. In the year 376, an enormous mass of Visigoths, estimates range from tens of thousands to over 100,000 people, men, women, children, warriors, farmers, entire families carrying everything they owned, appeared on the northern bank of the Danube River and begged the Roman Emperor Valens for permission to cross into Roman territory and settle. They were refugees, desperate, terrified refugees, fleeing a force they could not defeat. Valens agreed. It was a fateful decision. The Visigoths were allowed to cross the Danube and settle in the Roman province of Thrace in what is now roughly Bulgaria and northern Greece. But what should have been a managed resettlement quickly became a humanitarian catastrophe and then a military one. Roman officials tasked with overseeing the settlement were corrupt and cruel. They extorted the desperate Visigoths for food, sold them dog meat at outrageous prices, and in some documented cases enslaved Visigoth children. The promises Rome had made, land, food, protection, were not kept. The Visigoths, armed and furious, rose in revolt. Emperor Valens marched his army to crush them and met the Visigoths at a place called Adrianople in the year 378. What happened there was one of the most catastrophic military defeats in Roman history. The Roman army was routed. Valens himself was killed, the first Roman emperor to die in battle against a foreign enemy in over a century. Somewhere between 10,000 and 20,000 Roman soldiers died in a single afternoon. Adrianople did not destroy Rome, but it broke something. It shattered the myth of Roman military invincibility against the peoples of the north, and it established a precedent that would prove impossible to walk back. Armed barbarian peoples could now live inside the empire's borders, not as conquered subjects, but as quasi-independent communities, bound to Rome by treaty, but not fully controlled by it. The Visigoths were eventually settled, again, this time more carefully, inside Roman territory in the Balkans. Their leader Theodosius made peace with them, enrolling them as foederati, allied troops fighting under Roman command but maintaining their own internal leadership. It was a pragmatic solution. It was also a sign of how much Rome had changed. The empire was now dependent on the very peoples it could no longer reliably defeat. For the next generation, an uneasy peace held. But the pressures did not stop. The Huns continued pushing westward. More Germanic peoples were displaced. The Rhine frontier, along the more stable western border, began to buckle. On the night of December 31st in the year 406, a massive coalition of Germanic peoples, Vandals, Suebi, Alans, crossed a frozen Rhine River and poured into the Roman province of Gaul, which is today roughly France and Belgium. The garrison meant to hold the Rhine was simply not there. It had been stripped away to fight civil wars elsewhere. The invasion of Gaul in 406 was not just a military event. It was the permanent breaching of the Western Empire's northern frontier. The tribes that crossed the Rhine that night did not go back. They spread across Gaul, into Spain, eventually across the Mediterranean into North Africa. The western provinces of the empire began to fragment, each one pulled in a different direction by a different military force. And in this chaos, the Visigoths, still inside the empire, still technically allies, began to act on old grievances. Their king was a man named Alaric. He was, in many ways, the perfect symbol of the contradictions of late Rome. Alaric had served in the Roman army. He had fought for Rome, held Roman military titles, and understood Roman politics better than many Romans. But he had never been given the respect or the permanent settlement his people had been promised. He had been used and discarded, promised commands and then denied them, rewarded and then cheated. He was not a savage destroyer who hated Rome. He was a man who wanted to be Roman, who had been told he could be Roman, and who had been lied to. Alaric led his Visigoths into Italy. He besieged Rome, not once but 3 times. On the third attempt, in the year 410, the gates of Rome were opened, possibly by treachery from within, and the Visigoths entered the city. For 3 days, they sacked it. The psychological impact was immense. Rome had not been taken by a foreign enemy in approximately 800 years. The city that was called the Eternal City, the city that was said to be the center of the world, the city that Christians were already calling the seat of divine providence on earth. That city had been pillaged. St. Jerome, writing from the Holy Land when he heard the news, said that his voice stuck in his throat and sobs choked his words. The world's order had been overturned. Alaric himself died shortly after, somewhere in southern Italy. His people buried him in the bed of a river, diverting the waters, burying the king with his treasures, and then releasing the flow again so that no enemy could ever find and desecrate his grave. They killed the slaves who had dug the tomb, so the location would remain secret. It still is to this day. The Visigoths eventually moved on. They settled in southwestern Gaul and eventually in Spain, where they founded a kingdom that would last for nearly 3 centuries. But Rome never truly recovered from the shock of 410. The city itself survived. The Western Empire technically survived. But the sense of invulnerability, the deep cultural faith that Rome was simply eternal, that its power was natural and inevitable, that died in those 3 days. And the worst was still to come, because now the Huns themselves were moving west in earnest. Under their greatest king, the man the Romans called the Scourge of God, they would push the entire crisis of the 5th century to its apocalyptic crescendo. His name was Attila, and he was unlike any enemy Rome had ever faced. Attila became co-ruler of the Huns around 434 and sole ruler after the mysterious death of his brother Bleda in 445. He was not simply a warlord. He was a sophisticated political operator who understood that terror itself was a strategic weapon. His ambassadors appeared at the courts of Constantinople and Ravenna with elaborate demands backed by the implicit threat of total destruction. He extracted enormous tribute payments from the Eastern Roman Empire, the richer, more populous half based in Constantinople, and used those payments to fuel further campaigns. Attila's appearance was described by the Roman diplomat Priscus, who met him in person, a short man with a broad chest and large head, small, deep-set eyes, a flat nose, and a thin beard. Nothing about him suggested a conqueror of the world. And yet, when he spoke, rooms fell silent. He had an authority that seemed to radiate from some absolute certainty about his own destiny that others could not resist. In the year 451, Attila led his forces, a vast confederation of Huns and subject Germanic peoples, into Gaul. He burned cities, massacred populations, and moved through the province like a consuming fire. The cities of Metz, Reims, Troyes, and others were attacked or threatened. The population fled in terror. Attila seemed unstoppable. What stopped him was one of the most improbable alliances in ancient history. A Roman general named Flavius Aetius, himself a man who had spent years as a hostage among the Huns in his youth and knew them better than any Roman alive, formed a coalition with the Visigoths, who were now settled in Gaul and had no desire to see it burned any more than the Romans did. At a battle known as the Battle of the Catalaunian Plains, also called the Battle of Chalons, in June of 451, the combined Roman Visigoth force fought Attila to a standstill. It was a brutal, bloody engagement. The Visigoth king Theodoric I was killed in the fighting, but Attila withdrew from Gaul. He did not give up. The following year, 452, he invaded Italy. He burned the city of Aquileia so thoroughly that it never recovered. According to tradition, the refugees who fled Aquileia retreated into the lagoons of the Adriatic coast and founded what would eventually become Venice. Milan, Pavia, and other northern Italian cities fell or were threatened. The Emperor of the West, a weak and ineffectual man named Valentinian III, fled south. Rome itself seemed about to face Attila. And then, on a riverbank in northern Italy, something happened that has puzzled historians ever since. Attila met with a delegation led by Pope Leo I in the year 452. After that meeting, Attila turned his army around and left Italy without sacking Rome. Why? No one knows for certain. Pope Leo later claimed credit, suggesting that divine intervention had stayed Attila's hand. Practical historians point to the fact that Attila's army was suffering from plague, that supply lines were stretched dangerously thin, and that a new Eastern Roman army was threatening the Huns' homeland from the east. Perhaps it was all of these things. Perhaps Attila simply calculated that the costs outweighed the gains. Whatever the reason, he withdrew. And then, in the spring of 453, on the night of his wedding to a young woman named Ildico, Attila died. He was found in the morning lying in a pool of blood, having apparently suffered a severe nosebleed in his sleep and drowned in his own blood. Or perhaps he was murdered. No one will ever know. The death of Attila was the death of the Hunnic Empire. Without his unifying personality, the subject Germanic peoples revolted, and the Huns fragmented and faded from history within a generation. The most terrifying force of the 5th century simply disintegrated, but did not save Rome, because by now, the damage was too deep, the rot too far advanced. The Western Empire was a shell. It controlled Italy and pieces of other provinces and little else. The tax base had been shredded by decades of invasion and instability. The army was composed almost entirely of Germanic federati troops whose loyalty was to their commanders, not to any abstract idea of Rome. The emperors in the West were puppets. Real power lay with barbarian military commanders who made and broke emperors at will. In the year 455, just 2 years after Attila's death, Rome was sacked again, this time by the Vandals. The Vandals were a Germanic people who had crossed the Rhine in 406 as part of that great invasion, passed through Gaul and Spain, and then made an extraordinary crossing into North Africa, where their king Gaiseric had built a formidable kingdom centered on Carthage. The Vandals controlled the grain supply of the Western Mediterranean. North Africa had been Rome's breadbasket for centuries, and their fleet dominated the sea. When the Western Emperor Valentinian III was murdered by one of his own officers, the Vandals used the political chaos as an excuse to sail to Italy. They entered Rome without a fight in May of 455. They spent 2 weeks methodically stripping the city of its wealth, statues, gold, silver, artworks, the treasures of the Temple of Jerusalem that Titus had brought to Rome 4 centuries earlier. They took thousands of prisoners, including the widowed empress and her daughters. The English word vandalism comes from their name. Whether that is entirely fair is debatable. They were, by ancient standards, relatively restrained, but the reputation stuck. After 455, the Western Empire had perhaps 20 years left. It was, by any honest measure, already over. A succession of short-lived emperors, 9 in the span of 20 years, came and went, each one installed or deposed by the Germanic military commanders who held the real power. The last of them, a boy named Romulus Augustulus, the name combining Rome's legendary founder and its greatest emperor in one final ironic gesture, was deposed in the year 476 by a Germanic chieftain named Odoacer. Odoacer did not declare himself emperor. He sent the imperial regalia to the Eastern Roman Emperor in Constantinople with a letter explaining that one emperor was sufficient for the whole Roman world. The East would continue. The West was simply over. There was no battle, no final speech, no moment that the people living through it recognized as the end of an era. For most of the inhabitants of Italy and the Western provinces, daily life continued much as before. The same fields were farmed. The same markets were held. People spoke Latin in the streets for centuries to come. The bishops of Rome continued to hold enormous social authority. The great basilicas still stood. What ended in 476 was a political fiction that had already ceased to function years before. The last flicker of a flame that had been guttering for a century. But to say that Rome simply faded quietly would be to miss the full weight of what was lost. The Western Roman Empire at its height had maintained a level of urban civilization, infrastructure, and long-distance trade that would not be seen again in Western Europe for 500, in some areas 1,000 years. The population of the city of Rome itself, which may have reached 1 million at its peak, fell to perhaps 50,000 by the 7th century. The great aqueducts fell into disrepair. Roads crumbled. The sophisticated ceramic industries that had supplied standardized goods across the empire collapsed. Literacy rates plummeted. The complex monetary economy simplified into barter and subsistence. A continent that had been organized, administered, and connected dissolved into a patchwork of small, isolated communities, each struggling to survive. This is not to romanticize Rome, or to suggest that the barbarian successor kingdoms were without value. Many of them were the direct ancestors of the nations of modern Europe, and the fusion of Roman, Germanic, and Christian traditions would eventually produce medieval civilization, which had profound achievements of its own. But the transition was brutal. The people who lived through the 5th and 6th centuries in the Western provinces experienced a collapse of the world they had known, a disappearance of the certainties and comforts of Roman order. That was traumatic on a civilizational scale. And so why did it happen? After all the battles, all the invasions, all the sackings and the betrayals and the coups, what was the real cause? Historians have argued about this question for 1,500 years, and there is still no consensus. Some have emphasized the external pressure of the migrations, the Huns triggering a cascade of displaced peoples that the empire could not absorb. Others have pointed to internal factors, the economic decline, the political instability, the loss of civic virtue and shared identity that had once bound Roman citizens together. Edward Gibbon, in his monumental 18th century work, famously blamed Christianity, arguing that the new faith had turned Roman energies inward towards spiritual salvation rather than outward towards civic and military engagement. More recent historians have pushed back on that, noting that the Eastern Empire, equally Christian, survived for another 1,000 years as the Byzantine Empire and only fell to the Ottoman Turks in 1453. The most convincing explanations are not simple. They involve the intersection of climate change. There is evidence for a cooling period in the late Roman era that reduced agricultural yields, with plague, with political dysfunction, with economic collapse, with the particular dynamics of society that had solved its manpower problems by hiring the very peoples who would eventually replace it. Rome was not destroyed purely from the outside. It was a system under stress that failed from multiple directions simultaneously, each failure making the others worse, in a spiral that proved impossible to reverse. There's a lesson in that. Not a simple lesson. Not a warning easily reduced to a bumper sticker or a political slogan, but a genuine, complicated lesson about the fragility of the structures we build, the impossibility of permanence, and the way that the very solutions we reach for in moments of crisis can become the sources of future catastrophe. The barbarians did not destroy Rome because they were stronger, or because they were more righteous, or because history was on their side. They destroyed Rome because Rome had already done most of the destroying itself, and in doing so, had left a door open that it could never quite manage to close. The eternal city was not eternal. Nothing is. And that, in the end, is perhaps the most Roman lesson of all. What fell in the year 476 was not just a government or an army. It was an idea, the radical, audacious belief that human civilization could be organized into something permanent, something that transcended the chaos of individual lives and the brutality of individual ambitions. Rome failed. It failed spectacularly, slowly, and tragically. But the attempt mattered. The roads, the laws, the language, the art, they survived. They became the foundation on which the next world was built. That is what the greatest empires leave behind. Not their victories, but their echoes. If this journey through the fall of Rome gripped you, then subscribe to the channel right now. Every week we uncover the stories history forgot to teach you. Hit the like button if this video opened your eyes to something new, and drop a comment below telling us which empire or civilization you want us to explore next. Your support is what keeps these stories alive. Do not miss the next one. Subscribe before you leave.